off as the rescue workers try to do their job. As you can see behind me, the Trade Center...
Building 7 is clearly visible right behind the reporter. It wasn't until 5:20 Eastern Time that it came down. Buildings 4, 5, and 6 maintained heavy damage from falling debris from the towers, and yet they remained standing. In Madrid, Spain, this building burned for nearly 24 hours, a raging inferno, and it didn't fall. Building 7 received minimal damage and suffered only a minor fire, and yet it collapsed. The collapse of a concrete and steel structure due to a fire had never happened before September 11th. So how did the BBC know ahead of time that it was to come down, unless the cover story that had been prepared for public consumption had been released, in this case, a little too early? I don't think that there's any disagreement in the 9/11 research community that one of the strongest arguments that challenges the official story is the issue of controlled demolitions. There are multiple video angles, there are photographs, there's witness testimony explaining that there were bombs and explosions going off in and around the Trade Center. There's scientific data, all supporting the charge that these buildings were brought down by demolition charges. Well, if that's the case, we have to ask the question, what role did the planes play? There are those out there that get very upset when we talk about pods or flashes or substituted planes. Well, if these planes were indeed hijacked, that would mean that the hijackers would either have to be A, in collusion with those that had placed the charges in the North Tower, the South Tower, and in Building 7, one of the most secure buildings in New York City, if not the most secure building. Well, if it couldn't have been collusion, well, the only other option is coincidence. The hijackers just happened to fly the planes into buildings that were scheduled to be demolished just minutes later. Well, if it can't be collusion, and it can't be coincidence, then how could it have been terrorists? All of a sudden, the concept of flashes and pods and substituted planes becomes more plausible, and it doesn't conflict with the idea of controlled demolitions, but in fact supports the contention that the buildings were brought down by controlled demolitions. The countless reports of bombs and explosions going off in and around the World Trade Center were completely ignored by the 9/11 Commission and downplayed by the mainstream media. William Rodriguez's testimony before the 9/11 Commission was completely deleted, or shall I say, censored. Why is there such an effort to suppress information and evidence that might challenge the official story? Why do government officials and the media consistently try to ridicule or discredit those that would be in the best position to shed light on these irrefutable facts? Let's take a look now at what happened at the Pentagon and see if the same methodology has come to play.
No, I didn't. I just saw the aftermath of it, like the destruction of the building.
A less reinforced part of the Pentagon structure was the part that was hit by a fully fueled plane at a speed and at a point in the structure that was able to cause massive fire and explosion and thus take out that large swatch of the Pentagon that we all saw on the news.
A white plane, a very big jet, was flying in unusual pattern near the White House over Lafayette Park. Very slowly it made one circle, and then we have not seen it since.
The official story of Flight 77 tells us that this plane waltzed all over the eastern United States and turned around over Ohio at 30,000 feet, came back and hit the Pentagon at 9:37 in the morning. This was after, at 8:46, the World Trade Center had been hit, virtually almost an hour after the World Trade Center had been hit, and an hour and a half after the first multiple signs of multiple hijackings. We're told that this plane just waltzed into the most protected airspace in the world and hit the world's most protected building, the biggest military headquarters on the planet. This is already highly improbable.
Bottom line, in my professional opinion, based on my years of experience, my study of airline accidents, and incidents. It's my opinion that a Boeing 757 did not hit the Pentagon. There would be an abundance of wreckage, and that the official sources have not been able to produce the evidence of any wreckage. Large tail sections, indestructible landing gear, indestructible engines, wing spars, fuselage, seats, anything of the sort indicates to me that a 757 did not hit the Pentagon.
In relation to the Pentagon, it's quite obvious that no Boeing 757 hit the building. There are multiple lines of reasoning that support that conclusion, including, for example, the complete lack of massive debris of the kinds and character that would be expected from a 100-ton airliner with a 125-foot wingspan and a tail that stands 44 feet above the ground. The hit point was only about 10 feet high and 16 or 17 feet wide on the ground floor. You find unbroken windows, undamaged fence, a couple of automobiles. What you don't find is massive piles of aluminum debris. You don't find the wings, you don't find the seats, the bodies, the luggage, the tail. Not even the engines were recovered, indicating that no Boeing 757 hit the building.
You've got a hole that's no more than 10 foot high and about maybe 15 to 20 feet wide that we're expected to believe a multi-tonned 757 jetliner with a wingspan of 125 feet and a tail height of 44 feet, that's 4 stories, folks, somehow managed to squeeze through this one little bitty hole in the ground floor of the Pentagon.
Before the outer wall collapsed, which was about 45 minutes after initial impact, there was only one hole, about 14 to 16 feet. And supposedly the 757 completely penetrated this hole without leaving any indication of where the wings would have penetrated. Adjacent to this hole, the windows were completely intact, and you can tell by the firefighters' foam that was sprayed around the hole and sticking to the windows. The windows are completely intact, both adjacent where the wings should have penetrated and knocked the windows out, and also directly above the hole where the elevated tail section would have penetrated. You know, the windows are completely intact.
I measured pieces of Soviet equipment from photographs. It was my job. I look at the hole in the Pentagon, and I look at the size of an airplane that was supposed to have hit the Pentagon, and I said, the plane does not fit in that hole. So what did hit the Pentagon? What hit it? Where is it? What's going on?
A Boeing 757 has a wingspan of nearly 125 feet, a length of 155 feet, and a height of 44.5 feet. As was reported, if the plane was flying over 500 miles per hour, common sense would dictate there would be some indication, any indication, of an impact of the tail section in the upper floors. In addition, the heaviest and most massive parts of an aircraft of this type would be the engines. If there were to be any holes at all, they would be located where the engines would have impacted the Pentagon. The ASCE in January of 2004 released its Pentagon Building Performance Report, and along with that, a video computer analysis of what happened when the mysterious Flight 11 supposedly slammed into the Pentagon. Let's take a look at the report. What significant information was overlooked in this video from the American Society of Civil Engineers? Well, first of all, the 18.5-inch steel-reinforced concrete wall was omitted. Secondly, you'll note that when the tail section enters the Pentagon, it remains intact. How is this possible that the tail section, over 44 feet in height, could have remained intact as it entered the Pentagon and left no entry point as is seen in this photograph. Thirdly, and most significant of all, is that this plane has no engines in this computer graphic model. Despite these omissions, the ASCE claimed that the plane took out 50 support columns. In this photograph, do you see support columns that have been destroyed? At the World Trade Center towers, we were told that the fuel fires burning from the planes were so hot that they melted steel and collapsed the buildings in a pancake fashion.
High up in both towers, the raging fires were now generating 3 to 5 times the heat of a nuclear power plant.
If this were true for the World Trade Center towers, wouldn't the same heat have been generated at the Pentagon?
When we look at the photographs on page 313 of the 911 Commission report, what we see is that to the north side, the left side of the impact area, that the walls on all floors are totally intact. The inner office walls are intact. We see no fire damage as evidenced by the books not burned, the computer intact, the other things in the office desk intact. So when we go back and see the official Pentagon performance report, it said that the aircraft sliced in, taken all of these wall structures, all these support beams. Well, the wall structures are there, the support beams are intact, so there again the official report is contradicted by the photographic and video evidence.
Other than the 16-foot hole in the E-ring of the Pentagon, one of the most damning pieces of evidence to suggest an official cover-up is an examination of the official flight path of American Airlines Flight 77. The flight data recorder information recovered in the Pentagon wreckage shows the precise speed, altitude, and heading of the aircraft that we were told was Flight 77. If we examine the direction that Flight 77 took on its approach to the Pentagon, we'll note that the flight path is slightly different from that of the official report. This may seem insignificant at first, but how do we account for the light poles that were knocked down, even though they were not directly in the path of Flight 77? Secondly, if we take a look at the altitude of the aircraft, we'll note that mere moments before Flight 77 was to have impacted with light pole number 1 and light pole number 2, it was still 235 feet in the air. How is it possible that Flight 77 could have knocked over these light poles while it was at such a high altitude? Thirdly, if we take a look at light poles 3 and 4, we'll note that they are outside of the flight path of Flight 77 as well. How did these light poles come down? Following the flight path of the NTSB's model of the flight data for American Airlines Flight 77, we can see the flight path highlighted in red. Note that the plane passes over a light pole that should have been knocked to the ground, but remained standing after the event. What would explain this anomaly? Is it possible that the plane that impacted with the Pentagon was smaller than a commercial Boeing 757? After reviewing the photographs and the video footage taken at the Pentagon before the collapse of the outer E-ring, the experts that we've discussed this with, scientists, researchers, physicists, airline pilots, and military experts all agree that the damage seen is absolutely inconsistent with a 757 having struck the Pentagon. It is more consistent, however, with a smaller jet aircraft hitting the Pentagon, possibly a small jet, or a UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle, or maybe a Global Hawk missile. In this photograph that was taken at the Pentagon, we clearly see some sort of an engine rotor, but the question is this a rotor from a 757, a Rolls-Royce engine? Well, according to John W. Brown, a spokesperson for Rolls-Royce Engines in Indianapolis, he states it's not apart from any Rolls-Royce engine that he's familiar with.